Hello, my name is Todd Green. I am Associate Professor of Religion at Luther College in Iowa. And on behalf of the College's Center for Ethics and Public Engagement, I will be offering some reflections today on what impact the COVID-19 pandemic is having on religious communities here in the United States, particularly in regards to how government responses to the pandemic are affecting religious communities in terms of the question of freedom of religion. Let me begin by saying that as a religion scholar, there are actually a number of overarching questions that come to mind when I think about the coronavirus and its impact on religious communities in the United States, if not in other parts of the world. For example, how are governments, in the United States, in this case, state governments, striving to balance freedom of religion, includes the freedom to gather for worship, with public health? That's the question I'll be more exploring today. Other questions might be, how are religious communities adapting worship services and adapting rituals to alternative formats that safeguard public health, including online and virtual formats? And what is lost and what's gained in these adaptations for those who participate in them? Another question might be, how are religious practitioners and leaders responding theologically, philosophically, morally to the suffering and the death that the coronavirus has left in its wake? And this question, by the way, includes thinking about how religious communities are responding to the virus in terms of the problem of suffering, what in theistic traditions might be called theodicy. How do you reconcile an omnipotent divine being, a good divine being, presumably, with the kind of suffering that takes place in the world, in this case, the suffering left by the coronavirus? But this is also a question that includes thinking about how religious communities draw on their theological and moral resources to respond to, say, for example, the racial and economic disparities that have emerged in terms of who's impacted by the virus. All of these questions, amongst others, are worthy of exploration, and I wish I had more time to delve into each of them. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus my remarks today on that first question, the one pertaining to freedom of religion. As we know, the coronavirus pandemic has led many state governors to enact stay-at-home measures and to close non-essential businesses and services in an effort to enforce social distancing and thereby to prevent the spread of this deadly virus. Not every state has done this. I think about 9 governors have refused to issue such orders, though even in these states, most governors have taken some steps to limit the size of public gatherings or perhaps to close public schools. So almost every state in the United States has done something to try to minimize the spread of the virus, even if all of them have not enacted stay-at-home orders. The stay-at-home orders and the limitation, particularly on the size of public gatherings, has triggered controversy in some quarters of the country about freedom of religion. In particular, the question is this: do these stay-at-home orders and restrictions on gatherings violate the First Amendment's guarantee for the free exercise of religion? And how are these religious communities responding to these orders while also, again, trying to exercise their First Amendment rights, which includes, under normal circumstances, gathering for worship? Many churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, gurdwaras, etc., have canceled in-person gatherings, and in many cases they've moved their normally in-person worship or rituals to some sort of online or virtual platform. At times, this has gone smoothly, and I think it certainly in a number of cases has tapped into creativity and ingenuity among religious leaders and communities. But it's also without a doubt that such a transition has been an emotionally painful effort in some instances. For example, think of funerals in this age of the coronavirus. The bereaved are having to adapt to the restrictions placed on larger gatherings, and in many cases to adapt their religious rituals, even when doing so makes the grieving process far more difficult, if not far more painful. These adaptations may include limiting those present at funerals to 10 or less people, which a number of states have done. It might include live streaming funeral services or delaying memorial services until after the pandemic when more people can gather. In some instances, it's involved keeping family members in a cemetery at a distance until the burial is complete and the cemetery workers have left. You can add to this that different religious communities face different challenges due to various death rituals that they must observe. For example, in some states, Muslims are not allowed to ritually wash their dead if the person who has died from the coronavirus. The ritual washing with water that is a traditional practice in Islam has therefore to be replaced with some other ritual. Muslims have been forced in some cases to dig deeper and look elsewhere in their tradition in order to find other ways of performing this ritual that maybe doesn't involve water and in some instances may not involve contact with the body. Despite the inconvenience and at times the emotional pain that comes with altering ritual practices like this, and this is just an example with Muslims, but you can think of Jews who sit Shiva, which is normally a communal way of grieving, but now many Jews who are grieving their loved ones must sit Shiva in isolation, or Christians gathering at funerals. Whatever the case might be, you're still finding that many religious communities are adapting nonetheless. They are complying with stay-at-home orders and other restrictions on gatherings in order to do their part to prevent the spread of the virus. In other words, many synagogues, temples, mosques, churches, gurdwaras are adapting their rituals and they're adapting their traditions when needed, and they're doing so to prioritize public health and safety. I would argue that there's probably good evidence that's the vast majority of religious communities right now in the United States. But without a doubt, there are some religious leaders and communities that are resisting, if not defying, stay-at-home orders and orders that limit gatherings of 10 or more people, and they're doing so on First Amendment grounds. There are also some organizations that track religious freedom in the United States, particularly organizations focused on religious freedom for Christians, who have weighed in on these concerns, and while noting the importance of public health, have also expressed concern that state governors are overstepping their constitutional authority and issuing orders that prevent churches from gathering for worship or for other significant rituals. Now, before addressing some of these concerns, it's important to clarify that while the First Amendment guarantees the free exercise of religion, throughout American history, local, state, and federal governments have exercised their authority to regulate certain religious practices that are considered harmful or dangerous to some larger civic good. You can find this legal principle already in the writings of, say, someone like Thomas Jefferson in the 18th century. If we go back to the 18th century, when Jefferson was introducing legislation into the Virginia state legislature on religious freedom, he noted that while religious freedom in terms of freedom of belief, should be safeguarded, he also pointed out that religious practices stemming from such belief could, under certain circumstances, be regulated, including when, in the words of Jefferson himself, when, quote, principles break out into overt actions against peace and good order. What do you mean by this? Again, it's reasoning he employed elsewhere, including in his letter to the Danbury Baptist in 1801 after he won the presidential election, where again he argued that the legislative powers of the government reach actions only, not opinions. In short, he was saying you're free to believe what you want to believe in terms of religion. You're free to believe that the divine powers that be command you or mandate you to do certain things, but as soon as you translate these beliefs into actions, there are circumstances in which the civil government can intervene to regulate, if not restrict, those actions and practices. This became known as what we can roughly think of as a belief-practice distinction on the question of freedom of religion. Something that's not explicitly spelled out in the First Amendment itself, but you do find it in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, and you do find legal scholars, judges, courts throughout American history invoking Jefferson's logic in order to try to interpret the scope of the First Amendment when it comes to the free exercise of religion. All of this is to say that the First Amendment has been interpreted in a way that allows the government to regulate religious practices if the practice in question is deemed harmful in some way to the public or civic good. This is not to say that the government has always employed this rationale in a compelling manner, or that its interpretation of what constitutes harm or a threat to the public order or to civic good has been logical or consistent. Be that as it may, it's clear that even in the United States, a country that has boasted of religious liberty and oftentimes boasts of the supposed separation of church and state, the truth is that religious actions and practices have always been subject to some form of regulation. There is not a country in the world that doesn't, to some degree, regulate religious practices and actions, and the United States of America is no exception to that. So, for example, historically, if you look back to the 19th century, in 1879, the U.S. Supreme Court determined in a case called Reynolds versus the United States that Mormons were free to believe that they had a divine obligation or mandate in certain circumstances to engage in plural marriage, what oftentimes gets referred to as polygamy. But the court argued that the federal government nonetheless has the right to enact legislation to prohibit this belief from then being turned into practice. Chief Justice Morrison Waite, in the majority decision, made this point by drawing a parallel to a hypothetical situation in which one believes that human sacrifices are necessary to worshiping a divine power. Justice Waite argued that you can believe that all you want to. You can believe that human sacrifice appeases some deity out there. But as soon as you start to try to practice that in some extreme case, the civil government has every right and has the obligation to intervene to prevent such human sacrifices from taking place. It has a larger interest at stake in terms of the public good and the common good to do so. Justice Waite's belief that civil government at times can regulate religious actions is not unique. Of course, we can question whether he made a compelling argument that the Mormon practice of plural marriage was harmful or dangerous to the civic good, and we can also recognize that the prohibition of plural marriage is not the same thing as the prohibition of religious gatherings of 10 or more people in the age of the coronavirus. And I'm going to return to that point momentarily when I offer my own opinions about whether the government can and should impose restrictions today on religious gatherings. My point here is largely a historical one. Regulating religious practice is nothing new. It simply causes less controversy when religious practice is regulated when it's a religious minority in question. When it's the religious majority, the Christian majority, whose practices are being restricted, then we have a much larger controversy that usually emerges and that can envelop the nation. And you're seeing elements of that play out right now in the United States. All religious communities are affected by these stay-at-home orders to some degree, but it's because they have impinged upon Christians and their desire, in some cases, to gather or to defy these orders that we now have these larger national debates taking place about the scope of the First Amendment and freedom of religion. Okay, so we have this history of the regulation of religious practice in certain circumstances. Sometimes those decisions have been made in a compelling manner by courts and legal scholars. Sometimes they haven't. The question for us today, though, is this about the coronavirus and religious freedom. Is it fair? Is it good? Is it legal? Is it moral for state governments to impose some kind of stay-at-home orders that apply to religious gatherings in this age of the coronavirus? Here are my thoughts on this question. First, yes, I think that state government should be imposing restrictions on religious gatherings right now. In fact, I think the federal government should be intervening and doing more to help out with this. My reasoning is that the government has, in this particular case of the coronavirus and the public health ramifications of these larger gatherings, that the government has a compelling interest in limiting religious gatherings in terms of the numbers, because these gatherings can and often do have the potential of endangering public health. The key concept here is compelling interest. Broadly speaking, compelling interest is language that one finds in constitutional law to refer to instances in which the government's interest in maintaining some larger public or civic good takes precedence over otherwise constitutionally, legally protected rights and freedoms for individuals, including the free exercise of religion. The federal and state governments have limited religious practices for reasons in the past much less compelling than the reasons we would have now to limit certain kinds of religious practices. I think the plural marriage prohibition in the 19th century, in the case of the Mormons, is a good example of this. Whatever one might think of plural marriage from a theological perspective, a moral perspective, whether you agree personally or individually with such a practice, I think no compelling argument actually in the 19th century was made by the Supreme Court of the federal government in terms of whether plural marriage endangered the lives of the majority population or created some sort of harm to the society at large. We can debate that, of course, but if you read the Supreme Court decision on that case, I don't find it particularly compelling in terms of the rationale employed. But that's not the case here. A strong case can be made that religious gatherings in the age of the coronavirus can and do put lives at risk. We've seen evidence of this within the United States and outside the United States. For example, a Muslim pilgrimage in Malaysia in February of 2020 led to the spread of the coronavirus into probably a half dozen other countries. In South Korea, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak there can be tied to services held by a Christian group. Here in the United States, a Christian funeral that was held in Dowdy County resulted in a rapid transmission of the virus in this rural county in Georgia that led to the county having a per capita infection rate that was actually more than 2 times higher than New York City as of the beginning of April 2020. Large gatherings, religious or otherwise, put lives at risk, just as it is now commonplace to observe that the coronavirus does not recognize state borders, national borders, political affiliation, that sort of thing. We must also recognize that the coronavirus has no religious affiliation. Religious gatherings can and do take place for good reasons, but during this pandemic, such gatherings can become downright lethal to the larger public, and not just for those who attend the gatherings themselves. This means governments should intervene to limit these gatherings until the coast is clear. Governments have a legal obligation, in my opinion, to do this, and they have a moral obligation to do so. That's my larger thought on this question. But another thought I will add to this is that religious leaders, and I would add in the case of the United States, particularly Christian leaders, because Christian churches resisting these orders are the most high-profile examples of this happening, that I think Christian leaders, religious leaders, broadly speaking, need to dig more deeply into their theological toolkit and develop resources for responding to this pandemic that prioritizes the dignity of human life and encourages practitioners to act in such a way as to view their neighbor's health at least as important and as precious as their own. For churches who have resisted restrictions on gathering, I often am finding that such theology is lacking. But a concern for keeping the government at bay, whatever the political calculus of that, it tends to outweigh an ethic of compassion for one's neighbors. It may not be the case that these churches are trying overtly to harm their neighbors. Maybe they are not even thinking along those lines, but their resistance to government regulation in the name of the First Amendment reflects, in many instances, in my opinion, a shallow theological engagement on what obligations they have to their neighbors of whatever religion or no religion. Finally, it's worth noting that some state governors have responded to the pressure from some Christian communities, particularly, to relax restrictions on gatherings by giving churches and other houses of worship exemptions to otherwise broadly applicable stay-at-home measures. The governors of Texas and Florida, for example, have provided now exemptions for religious communities by arguing that offering religious worship services constitutes essential services. Other governors in other states have made similar exemptions. So even where there are some stay-at-home orders, we have seen a trend in some states of giving exemptions to religious communities, in part to maybe balance out the First Amendment concerns that have been raised, but also, I think, probably to address larger political concerns about losing support from an important constituency. Again, I suspect that these exemptions are probably driven more by political calculus than by deeper legal reasoning or philosophical or moral reasoning. And while I disagree vehemently with these exemptions in some of these states due to the public health risk that are incurred by allowing religious gatherings of 10 or more people to take place, I do want to add that I am still nonetheless sympathetic to this desire to rethink what constitutes essential services. At the very least, our nation would benefit from reflecting on how we define what is essential to the public in these difficult times. A strong argument can be made, and I think I would be sympathetic to this, that religious traditions provide people, or at least people who adhere to these traditions, with ways to cope with economic and mental stress, not to mention threats to their physical well-being, that is essential in this particular time. Religious traditions can facilitate human compassion and human connectivity in this period of social and physical isolation. And I think this is important to look at. I think there are many ways that this can be done that do not involve gathering in groups of 10 or more people for any period of time while this coronavirus is a threat. But I do recognize that for many people in the United States, religions have the capacity to heal and to make meaning out of pain and tragedy in ways that cannot be done in quite the same way as other essential services that are more broadly recognized. Grocery stores, pharmacy, and healthcare facilities, for example. All of that is worth taking seriously as we continue to think through what is essential for the functioning of individuals and communities during these trying times. Thank you for your attention to my reflections on the impact of the coronavirus on freedom of religion and the free exercise of religion here in the United States. And once again, thank you to the Center for Ethics and Public Engagement at Luther College for sponsoring this presentation. My best wishes to all of you. Stay safe, stay healthy.